Good. Okay, I know she said no break, but if you need to take one, go ahead. Okay, like they said, I gotta stay close. I am Dr. Frances Ellmo. I am a counselor, but I also teach future counselors, so I get to help train people. I am not in law enforcement. I'm not a judge. I'm not a legislator or someone who's in charge of making laws, but I am someone who is passionate about paying attention to legislation that affects us all as mental health professionals and people in the substance use world. And I also have worked a little bit with this population of people who have substance use disorders within the criminal justice system. So that's a little bit of my background. I'm going to talk to us today about this kind of very unique intersection that we have between substance use and laws in our country. There have been a lot of laws that have attempted to do something about substance use rates in our country. Some have been more successful than others, so I'm gonna do a little bit of a historical review, and then I'll also talk about what it's like to work with this population and some ways that we can all maybe commit to help. All right, so the most common laws that relate to substance use have to do with limitations related to age, location, or substance. When I say limitation on age, what's the one that comes to mind? They have to be 21 to drink alcohol, right? That's the one that most people think of. Does anyone know why the law is 21? Why is it not a different number? Okay, yeah, I'm hearing some good stuff. So this law was changed in the 80s. It used to be 18, right? And so they upped it to 21 because at the time, research was just starting to come out about brain development, right? And how, yeah, I see some people nodding. You knew. The kind of longer we give the brain to develop before it's exposed to substances, the better, outcomes people have, better long-term, things like that. And so even now, right, the research actually says it's more like 25, mid-20s. We haven't seen a big push to change that law to 25 or anything like that, but at the very least, 21 gets people out of high school, too, at that point. Now, we do know that people don't necessarily not drink until they're 21, right? We know that people do drink under the legal age, but even still, the data that came out after they changed the minimum age showed that it was moving up the age when people were first coming in contact with alcohol. And what we know is that the age of first contact tells us a lot about someone's risk factor for developing a substance use disorder later in life. When it comes to location, the most popular kind of restriction around this, or the one that people know about, is marijuana, right? Because in some states, it is legal medically and or recreationally, and in other places like Tennessee, it is not. And then also by substance, right? So some substances are regulated very heavily and some are less so. We have things that are passed at the federal level as well as the state level, and then sometimes at the local level, but we don't see too many substance-related things happening at that level. How is substance, maybe I should just hold this. There we go. Substance legislation introduced and made into law. Don't know if anyone remembers Schoolhouse Rock, right? Like, I'm just a bill on Capitol Hill. I'm not gonna sing it for you, but just very briefly, a legislator, so someone who's a member of either Congress, either the House of Representatives or the Senate, they introduce a bill, it goes to a subcommittee, the subcommittee researches it, they vote on it, they decide if it's gonna move and get voted on by everyone. Everyone votes on it in that particular chamber, either the House or the Senate. If it's passed there, it goes to the other chamber. If it's passed there, then it goes to the president to either veto or sign into law. There we go. Okay. So for my next two slides, we're going to do a little bit of a historical review about some laws that I think are kind of interesting related to substance use. If you are a person that is not a big history buff, you might not be too interested in the next two slides, but I do have other parts of the presentation as well. Okay, so the very first law that we saw in our country that was passed related to substances was the Indian Prohibition Act, which restricted the sale and use of alcohol on native lands, so lands that were set apart for tribes. And there was some indigenous support, so some people did support this law, but it was mostly an effort in the United States for the government to kind of maintain some authority on those tribal lands. Then moving forward, we see in 1875, the San Francisco Opium Den Ordinance. This is a local ordinance just for San Francisco. They had a lot of immigration that was happening at the time, particularly from China, where smoking opium was more of a cultural practice, right? And so then now they've moved to California, and people who were not necessarily using it as a cultural practice start to smoke opium. We start to see a lot of people developing what we now call addiction. They weren't really calling it that then, but that was the first time that, people saw this issue of, wow, people are having a trouble with the substance. Let's try to do something about it. So those two laws were kind of focused a little bit on those areas. Then the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. This was actually mostly focused on food, but there was a little bit in there about drugs and making sure that doctors who are prescribing drugs were doing so for therapeutic reasons. I'm going to move forward just for time to the 18th Amendment, which is what we all know is prohibition. And prohibition was to prohibit the use of alcohol, right? But what it actually was it just really reduced the ability to legally sell and transport alcohol through the United States. And so unfortunately, a lot of people were still drinking at this time, and so the law didn't really work. It was very unpopular, and it also led to a huge rise in organized crime, which became a huge issue. One of the reasons for that law was people at the time believed that drinking led to immoral activity, right? Things like corruption and domestic violence. And so they wanted to see reduction in those things, but this law didn't actually do that. And so then it was repealed by the 21st Amendment in 1933. So we had about 13, 14 years where it was illegal to transport and sell alcohol, but not necessarily to drink alcohol, because people definitely still were drinking alcohol during that time, right? It was the Roaring 20s. We all know people were partying then. As alcohol prohibition got to be less and less popular, though, prohibition of other drugs was still decently popular. So during that time, we saw our narcotics law that was passed, as well as the Marijuana Tax Act. The Marijuana Tax Act was not something that made it illegal to use marijuana in any way, but it implemented a really high tax on it, and so it kind of priced people out. It made it too expensive for some people to use that substance. Okay, modern day substance laws, so these are ones that you might be more familiar with. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970. This was the very first piece of federal legislation that that was explicitly banning the use of controlled substances. Also, as a part of this law, we see the development of the Drug Enforcement Administration and the scheduling of drugs, right? So we know nowadays drugs are scheduled in order of kind of most likely to cause abuse potential, as well as their medical benefit. It's not on here, but the minimum drinking age being raised happened, I think it was 84. 1986, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act was passed. Hopefully you can see this picture. I know they're really small, but this basketball player on the end over there, his name was Len Bias. Is anyone familiar with this story? Yeah, okay, good. So Len Bias was a really, really promising young basketball player. He had finished his college career. He was really the next big thing. He got drafted to the Boston Celtics, and then within 2 days of being drafted, he suffered a fatal overdose on cocaine. And so at that time, it was a huge news story, right? Everyone was talking about it. It created a really big, honestly, moral panic in the country. People who weren't at all worried about cocaine, hadn't been paying attention to it, suddenly were paying attention to it. In some ways, that was good because we were seeing really high rising cocaine use at that time. So it was good that people were starting to pay attention. But this law was really the impetus for it was his death, as well as, like I said, rising cocaine issues in the country. Okay, so as a result of that law, it really just kind of was a follow-up to the Controlled Substances Act. It further regulated, increased punishments, different things like that. Moving forward, there was a number of laws that were passed in the 90s that really just continued to increase punishments for use and possession. So the Solomon-Lautenberg Amendment, this is known as the smoke a joint, lose your license law, because it imposed minimum sentences where people would have their driver's license suspended. And then the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, again, just harsher punishments. But one of the main things that came out of this one is the 3 strikes provision that you might remember. But basically, if someone had 3 similar drug offenses, they were arrested that 3rd time. On the 3rd time, they would face a mandatory minimum life sentence. And there are unfortunately people who are still incarcerated today under that specific law. So heavy punishment for a while, heavy punishment. But then later in the 90s, we start to see a little bit of a cultural shift. California becomes the first state to legalize medical marijuana. So if you had certain medical conditions that qualified, you could get a little card or basically a license to go to a legal dispensary to get your marijuana for medical purposes. So that was the very first state in 1996, and then now, today, 2025, there are 39 states that have legalized medical marijuana. Tennessee, obviously not one of them. In 2010, we see the Fair Sentencing Act passed, and this was mainly an attempt to undo some of the really high punishments that had been implemented in the 80s and 90s. And unfortunately, kind of looking back, we can realize that some of those punishments were really directed at certain groups of people. They were pretty discriminatory in nature. And so the Fair Sentencing Act was an attempt to kind of undo that. In particular, I meant to mention that as a part of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, that was again targeting cocaine, and in particular crack cocaine. There was a provision in that law that made it so there was a mandatory 5-year minimum sentence if you were caught with 5 grams of crack cocaine, where the same minimum sentence of 5 years, you had to have 500 grams of powder cocaine in order to receive the exact same sentence. And so this was already obviously very targeted. I think a couple people already today have mentioned crack cocaine is a lot cheaper for people to buy, so it's used by lower income folks. And so they're obviously very targeted by that, as well as some racial minority groups as well. So anyways, the Fair Sentencing Act attempted to undo some of that disparity that had been written into the law previously. I won't say it completely undid it all, right? We do still see some of that, unfortunately, but it helped a lot. Okay, and then in 2012, we see the very first states, Colorado and Washington, both in 2012, legalized recreational marijuana. And since 2012, so the last 13 years, we now have 24 states that have recreational marijuana legalized, so about half. It's kind of a lot. Again, not Tennessee. And I think the interesting thing about this is, for a while, it really felt like a big cultural shift where people are, it's every time you turn around, you were hearing about another state who was introducing legislation related to marijuana. But in 2024, in the fall of 24, very recently, we had 4 states who had recreational marijuana on the ballot to vote on, and all 4 states voted against it. And so 2024 was the very first year that since I think it was 2016, that we have not had a single state pass recreational marijuana law, which I think is really interesting. I don't know if that was just 2024 specifically, or if maybe we're starting to see a different type of cultural shift. I'm not really sure yet. And then the last thing on my timeline here, and then I'll move past the history lesson, is that in 2020, we saw our first state, which was Oregon, vote to decriminalize all drugs. So basically with this law, what happened was if you were caught with very small quantities that were intended for personal use, right? So you weren't intending to sell it or traffic it or anything like that, that you would not be charged with a crime. Instead, you would be issued a citation that carried a monetary fine. And if you called a hotline that Oregon had put into place to hear about treatment options, you didn't even have to go to treatment. You just had to call the hotline and hear what they had to say about treatment. If you called the hotline, they would waive your fee. Unfortunately, the decriminalization efforts haven't been particularly successful by a lot of different metrics, so only about 5% of people who were issued one of those citations actually called the hotline. Now again, you didn't even have to go to treatment, you just had to call and listen, kind of like a timeshare presentation, right? So to me, that seems like a really good deal, but it really wasn't utilized. And And then, of course, the other kind of unfortunate side effect is that since this law was passed in 2020 through like early 24, Oregon saw a 61% increase in their fatal overdoses in that state, which is very high. During that time period, we did see an increase nationally, but not anywhere near that high. So in 2024, Oregon actually, with bipartisan support, voted to kind of undo most of their decriminalization efforts. So once again, now in 2025, it is a crime to possess and use any amount of our controlled substances. They did keep the treatment hotline, and I think they're trying to revamp it and make it better. They are still really focused on diverting people into treatment, which I think is good. Yeah, so that's kind of a review of some of these laws. The main thing I want to point out about all of these different laws is that we have tried a lot of different things over the years to try to battle substance use, and not one of these laws has been the thing, right? Not a single one of them has been the one that's made the big difference. And so I think the takeaway from that is that whether you're trying to completely prohibit something, whether you're trying to use regulatory containment, right, so increasing taxes, or making it harder to get to something, or even maybe like these laws that are more recently focused on treatment, none of those have quite 100% done it. And so the takeaway here, I think, is that we need to keep working on it, and that it's not just up to the law to solve this issue, right? That there's a lot that we can all be doing to help with it. Okay, so all of those laws that I just talked about, who is impacted by those? In some ways, we all are, right? Because we all are citizens of this country and we're all supposed to obey the law. But unfortunately, the people who are most impacted are people with substance use disorders. So about 2 million people with a substance use disorder are arrested every year. And then there's also additional people who are arrested who might not meet the full criteria, but still sort of have some type of substance issue. About 20% of people who are arrested don't qualify for a substance use disorder, but they were specifically under the influence of drugs or alcohol at the time of their crime. And then thinking about people who are actually incarcerated. So our prison population, the estimates vary, but it's somewhere between 50 and 65% of the current prison population meets the criteria for a substance use disorder. That's a massive number. If we think about the general population, the number is about 8%, which I think is already way, way, way too high. And so if it's really 2/3 of the people, right, this is where the people are who have substance use issues. I also need to mention, too, that if you think about people who are dying in custody, so either in jail or prison, drug or alcohol intoxication or withdrawal is the third leading cause of death for people in custody. The first one is illnesses or health issues. The second one is suicide. And then the third one has to do with substance use. The specific impact of substance laws, we talked about who it's impacting, how is it impacting them. Sometimes I hear people say, well, like, if these laws aren't really working to keep people from using substances, why do we have them? Why do we keep trying? And the reason is because there is still an impact. In a lot of ways, the ways that people use substances vary depending on what the law is. So when the law changes to restrict availability or impact price, or whatever it is, people change the way that they are looking for substances, they change the way that they obtain the substances, they change the way that they actually use them, who they use them around, the location that they use them in. And so all of those things kind of work together to create this category of substance use behaviors that are heavily impacted by what's legal and what's not legal. So yes, people are absolutely still using, right? I mentioned earlier, like, people are still drinking before they turn 21, but they have to do it in a very specific way, right? They can't just go to a bar and do it in the same way that maybe an adult would. The next thing that's impacted are our cultural norms. I'll just stay on the 21st birthday thing for a second. The 21st birthday has become a huge, culturally significant event in our country, even for people who were drinking prior to turning 21, right? It's a big celebration that now it is legal for them to drink. We were just hearing about gambling. It's kind of similar, you turn 18, you can go get a scratch off or a lottery ticket, right? So we base our cultural norms underneath this umbrella of what is normal to do in the country, which is heavily impacted, of course, by our laws. On the other side, we have our public health outcomes, and this could be like a whole presentation in and of itself, and I'm not a public health policy person necessarily, but we do see positive outcomes from a lot of these laws, at least some of the recent ones that we have pretty good data for, maybe not, the really old ones in the 1800s. But more recently, even though we haven't stopped people from using these substances or developing substance use disorders, like I said, we are still seeing some positive impact. For example, with raising the minimum drinking age to 21, we saw vehicle fatalities decrease in our country by, I think it was like 60%, so that's very high. Now, we can't completely attribute that to adolescents not drinking, right? Because also at the same time, regulations for cars were getting better, all of that stuff. But it is partially attributed, right? Because if you've got an adolescent who's just learning to drive and they're also maybe drinking, those things don't mix very well, right? So the fact that we all are able to drive around somewhat safely is thanks, in partial thanks, right, to some of these laws. And then the last thing on this slide that I'll mention is public perceptions. So the way that we perceive substances is heavily impacted by the law. If I asked you in here to talk about some of the more dangerous substances, you would probably list the ones that are illegal, right? And they're illegal for a reason. They do have a lot of risk associated with them. I'll just mention briefly an example. So I teach addiction counseling for master's students, and when I teach this class early on in the semester, I tend to have students do an activity where I ask them to work together to arrange a list of substances from least dangerous to most dangerous. And they have to work together on this. They have to debate and come to a consensus on what is the most dangerous substance, what is the least dangerous substance. And it's interesting because pretty much every semester, the same most dangerous substance is listed, which is fentanyl. And also the same least dangerous substance is always down at the bottom, and that's marijuana. And it's really interesting because I have things on the list like caffeinated soda and things like that. And so I really think there's a huge cultural shift related to marijuana now that it's becoming legal to use recreationally. Again, not in our state, but across the country. And so I'm definitely seeing that in the perception of my students. I don't know if anyone else has sort of noticed similarly. Okay. So when it comes to perceptions, we have to talk about stigma. This is an area that I'm particularly interested in. There are 3 different types of stigma that we talk about when we talk about stigma. The first is structural stigma, which is kind of what this whole presentation is about, right? Things that are written into the law or policies or that are present in our macro systems that affect people. So some of those discriminatory laws that I was talking about fall into this category. When stigmatizing language is written in the law in particular, that's a really big one because then that's the language that's used in court by law enforcement, and it sort of trickles down and then everyone's using that language, right? Social stigma, so this is when the people around you sort of isolate from you, they other you because of your, not necessarily because of your substance use, but because of their beliefs about your substance use. So an example up here, believing people in recovery are untrustworthy or deceitful. And then the last one, and I want to focus on this for just a second, is self-stigma, which is the internalized negative view of self. And I think this one we don't talk about enough, but if enough people around you, if the law around you, all the systems around you are telling you, this is bad, you are bad because you are doing this, then you start to really believe that about yourself, and that unfortunately kind of contributes to what is called the why try effect, or it's basically like, well, why would I try to engage in treatment, or why would I try to engage in recovery if everyone around me doesn't think I can do it? And so that self-defeating prophecy becomes true, then they don't even seek out treatment, and if they don't seek it out, then they really don't have the opportunity to engage with it. And that treatment seeking is really, really important because that is how we help people. All right, so what are some very specific challenges that people within the justice system face? And the first thing I'm going to mention is impact on symptoms, but really it can exacerbate symptoms, right? So the same reasons that people are potentially seeking out substances are also, it's just going to get worse, right? So it's a traumatic experience. People have co-occurring disorders in particular. There's a term in the literature called triple stigma that refers to people who have a substance use disorder, a mental health disorder, and involvement with the criminal justice system. Withdrawal. So this is withdrawal symptoms, right? So a lot of times when people are arrested or incarcerated, it kind of forces them into withdrawal. We are seeing some better knowledge about detox services available in these environments, but for a while that wasn't really an option, and so we did see some, deaths as a result of that. But just having an awareness of what withdrawal might look like in a correctional setting. And then isolation from social support. So when you are put into the justice system, right, you're removed from your family and your friends. You may or may not have good contact with them, just depending. And the thing that we know about addiction is that it thrives in isolation, and that social support is a really important piece of recovery. The lack of treatment availability and implementation within the justice system. So technically, the Supreme Court has ruled that people who have substance use disorders who are incarcerated have a right to treatment, but they didn't really say what that treatment is or what it should look like, and so it varies so much. In different facilities, some of them are doing a pretty good job, and others really don't have very much available at all. And then when it comes to actually being released, right, transitioning back into the community, this is a really tough time. A lot of times people maybe not have health care, right, which is, again, a barrier to treatment. If they are needing education or housing, I mean, if you don't know where you're going to stay that night or where your next meal is coming from, it's really hard to focus on recovery. And then I also just really want to mention, too, that the leading cause of death for people who are released from incarceration within 7 days is overdose. So that usually has to do with decreased tolerance, right? So you're incarcerated, your tolerance goes down. Even if potentially you're still accessing substances, you're not supposed to, but we know it happens. Either way, it's not in the same quantity or frequency as previously. And so, unfortunately, a lot of people will return to their regular dose after being released, and it can be fatal. And then the last thing I want to mention on this slide is recidivism. This is a really big word. Some people really don't care that much about the treatment aspect of this. They kind of think, do the crime, do the time, and I can sort of understand that mentality. But what people really do care about is recidivism. And unfortunately, what we know is that people with substance use disorders are actually a lot more likely to be rearrested and end up back in the justice system. So how do we... There we go. How do we address this? What do we do? Our two main goals, which are really big goals here, are increasing recovery and decreasing that recidivism that I was just talking about. Early identification of substance use disorders at all points of contact. This is really important. So being able for having CIT-trained officers, right, to maybe recognize it pre-arrest or during arrest, that can be important during the booking process or during adjudication. Having judges and people like that understand what it looks like, as well as during their contact with the justice system, so while they're incarcerated. And then that reentry that I was just talking about. Even if we didn't catch them at any point during up to that, right, maybe we can help them now that they're transitioning back to the community. So a lot of different opportunities to intervene, but what we do know is that the most effective treatment starts when first coming in contact with the justice system, and then it's sustained after release. So those two pieces are really key to seeing those positive outcomes. And when people only have one or the other, or often neither, that's when we see the recidivism, that's when we see those negative outcomes. Okay, I can't talk about this topic without also talking about recovery or drug courts. In Shelby County, we have a drug court. I think statewide they're referred to as recovery courts. Different places call them different things. We are actually fairly lucky in Tennessee and in Shelby County to have this opportunity and to have a drug court system. Although I did hear someone earlier mention needing one for juveniles, which I agree with. I think that would be wonderful. But anyways, so having those opportunities or other types of diversion opportunities when appropriate for that individual can be really helpful. And then the other thing that I think is really important to talk about is collaboration between disciplines. So I mentioned earlier that, unfortunately the law itself hasn't really done the trick. And of course, I'm a counselor, so I believe that mental health services is a really important piece of the puzzle, but I also know it's not the only piece, right? There's public health piece, there's a medical piece, right? There's a lot of different moving pieces, and we all need to work together on this particular issue. So on the screen here, there's just a list of potential disciplines that could be involved with this, but there's, even as I'm reading this list, I'm noticing like teachers aren't on here, and I think that could be an important piece too, as well. So working together with other people, exactly what we're doing in this room right now. Okay, so what are some things that we can do? The first one is really easy, and I think probably a lot of people in this room are already implemented this piece of it, but utilizing non-judgmental language. Like I said, some of that is really written into our law, and so it's hard to break some of those habits, but really focusing on it, that is a really good place to start if you don't know anywhere else to start. Anything that we can do to reduce stigma, particularly that self-stigma, can be really, really helpful. Trauma-informed care, I think this could be its own presentation in and of itself, so I won't get too much into it, but just having an understanding of what it's like for someone to move through the justice system. Again, regardless of whether or not you believe they should be there, just having an acknowledgement that what's happening to them is potentially traumatic, or at the very least potentially exacerbating their symptoms, and we do care about their symptoms, so how can we work with that? Something that we're, of course, the Memphis Area Prevention Coalition is known for, but promoting harm reduction practices and overdose prevention policies. I mentioned earlier that a lot of these laws haven't had really good outcomes, like the data doesn't say that they worked, but the data does tell us that harm reduction practices are making a really big difference. Even I think the police officer here earlier was discussing how last year's was the first year that we really saw a decrease in a while in overdoses, and they're really attributing that to the availability of Narcan, as well as the education that's being done about the dangers of opioids and fentanyl. So those things we do know work really well, and so when we know something works, let's do more of it. And then the last thing is that I think it's really important for us to pay attention to legislation and to advocate to our legislators. And I know that right now, especially federally, things are maybe a little bit chaotic, but I think it's still really important to pay attention to this. It's hard to look away, but there are things that are happening. I talked about earlier like how a bill becomes a law. I think a lot of us don't realize that a law is about to happen until it's made it all the way through both chambers, right, and is maybe sitting on the president's desk waiting to be signed. And at that point, there isn't a whole lot that we can do, right, except just be mad about it. But our legislators, like where they get the ideas to write a bill, it comes from their constituents, it comes from us, right? And we are experts in our field. They want to hear from us. They want to know about the things that we care about. And so I found a lot of success in communicating with them in their offices, both as just like a regular everyday citizen as well as a mental health professional. I found them pretty open to that. And so if there's legislation that you care about, or there's an aspect of this that you think is really important to continue to fight substance use disorders and overdoses, contact your legislators, like let them know. Some ones that are like fairly popular, they're pretty easy sells to make, are diversion programs, access to treatment, right? As well as other support services, funding and things like that for peer support, as well as other community services. Those are pretty popular, but there are tons of other ideas out there. Like I said, I really, when I heard someone earlier talk about a juvenile drug court, I was like, yeah, that's a great thing. I'm gonna make myself a note to pay attention to that and contact someone about, because I think that could be really good. Another one that I see some other states passing is more access to medications for opioid use disorder. I think that could be really beneficial as well, but it doesn't matter what it is. It's whatever aspect of substance use is important to you. What are you seeing with the people that you're working with? That's what your legislators want to hear about, and that's what is gonna make the change. So that's my little soapbox, I guess. If you have any takeaways from this presentation, it would be that we have to work together, as well as pay attention to legislation. I think that's really, really important. That is all that I've got for y'all. I've got my